rich white guy to tell me how my gender is doing, I'll put my hand up. We do not need another man who has no idea what it's like to walk a mile in my shoes telling us that we're actually quite happy, thank you. There is, we're still battling for equal pay. And I think the women he's describing is the ones who don't want the big jobs. And I think for a lot of women who get to that level, it's very much a case of your circus, your monkeys. We don't want to be you guys. We don't want to be Kevin Roberts with his $4 million pay packet. We don't want to be top of the tree because we would rather be doing work that actually means something. And so many of us will turn down those big corporate jobs.
But isn't that what he said?
No, but it's not because we want to. It's because that is not how it works for us. It is really hard for us to break that glass ceiling.
But he
because
also
it's not
said
glass, it's brick.
But he also said it was many women and many men wanted to be happy and do great work and so turned down the advancement.
Well, I can't speak for men because I'm not a man.
And that often happens in teaching too, doesn't it? The number of really great teachers that turn down advancement to vice principal or principal because they want to teach. And it would be really good if we could look after teachers, great teachers who wanted to teach instead of making them go into the office and do all the attendances and all the other things.
Well,
and sometimes you're enjoying the job at a lower level, and at the higher level you end up taking away the enjoyment.
Well, you do, but the gender argument of that is if you want to break that glass ceiling, you basically have to be Kevin. You have to be like him. You have to be like all those corporate men who enjoy a different lifestyle, who are in their own minds leaders of the world and gods of business. And we are not those people. In women-led companies, you'll find the culture is completely different, and women will do well. So I'm not surprised that many women, and as you say, men in Saatchi's, would say to Kevin Roberts, "No, thank you. Keep it."
Look, do you buy? Someone has to lead the millennials, don't they? So do you buy the generalisation that they emphatically value collaboration over ambition, and that's going to change the world in some way?
Yeah, millennials have a really different attitude. I mean, they want to work part-time, they want lifestyle, which is great. I mean, good on them if they can get away with it. I actually support it. And I think that's a problem with a lot of the business models. People who are running these businesses are old men like Kevin, and they think that everyone should work full-time and do, 60-hour weeks and more, and that's just not going to happen. And it can't happen for many women who have children, who have, they just cannot do those hours. So, it's not a choice.
But do you think what he said, though, is enough to fire him from his job?
Yeah,
Yes, it's long overdue. I remember listening to him about 20 years ago with spouting on about how wonderful he was and how we all had to be geese and honk and follow the leading geese. And I remember thinking, what a ridiculous man back then. So it's long overdue.
Do you sense a changing of the guard? Because you've kind of implied it. A headline in the National Post in Canada: what happens when white men realise their perspective isn't the only one that matters? Are we seeing a thoroughgoing rebellion now against the traditional white male view of the world, starting with that white man on the sailing ship, Captain Cook, which we've been hearing about in New Zealand? Is this a sea change now?
I certainly hope so. And one of the things I was going to talk about today also, which I decided not to, but I will now just briefly, the more you see women in public office, the more you see the Hillary Clintons, Theresa May, the more you see women stepping up, the more you hear misogyny, the more you get men putting them down, criticising them. Helen Clark spent her whole time in office being criticised for the clothes she wore, being accused of being a lesbian, the lesbian mafia. We all remember that. And so there is a sea change going on, and I think it is, on one side there's misogynists going right off, and then on the other side there's women going, okay, this is our chance, let's support, let's go, which is why I was so upset that Helen Clark wasn't supported by the Maori Party. Because,
and that's why I can't understand why Hillary Clinton gets such bad things, especially on places like Fox and others. It's just incredible.
It's misogyny. I mean, Fox is just misogyny with a capital
But I'm talking
M.
about the female hosts as well. It's sad.
Yeah, well, there are...
It's women's fault.
As we end this hour, thank you for that.
Wendell Nissen, lovely to have you on.
Thank you.
And Barry Corbett, great to have you back too, Barry. Thank you.
It's always good. Thanks, matey. Bye.
That's us for another day. Thanks for your company, everyone. And Checkpoint with John Campbell coming right up.
Kia ora everyone, I'm John Campbell, and on behalf of our excellent team, haere mai, welcome to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Tau te maira, e hoa mā, hei kōrero, kei te haere, hei kaupapa, kei te karawhiua. Tonight, David Bain, no compensation, no apology, but $925,000 anyway. We look back at the case, we get reaction, we talk to the author of the first compensation report who argued compensation was due, and we hear from a senior barrister who says the compensation process is too politicised. Accusations someone with the Chiefs rugby team shouted homophobic slurs at a member of the public. Marama Fox said the Māori Party does not back Helen Clark's bid for the position of head of the UN. So what of the woman who formed the Māori Party in protest against the foreshore and seabed legislation? Yes, we know it's winter, but by Auckland standards, some miserably cold weather is on the way. August standards, sorry, not Auckland standards. E-cigarettes, and we meet the New Zealand Olympians who are still in their teens. All that and much more in the next 89 minutes. But first, Katrina Batten with RNZ News.
Kia ora, good evening. David Bain is angry at the government for refusing him compensation, but has accepted a special payment of nearly $1 million. Mr Bain spent 13 years in prison for the 1994 murders of his family in Dunedin before being acquitted in a retrial 7 years ago. He will not receive any compensation for wrongful conviction or imprisonment, but he will receive a $925,000 ex gratia payment for the time and cost the case has taken to settle, and an agreement not to take any future legal action. The Justice Minister Amy Adams announced the settlement today after a final report from a retired judge, Ian Callanan, found Mr Bain had not met the threshold to prove his innocence. David Bain, who's 44, insists he is innocent of any wrongdoing.
Ms Adams, Ms Collins, Mr Callanan, they've all got it wrong. I am innocent. I didn't do anything that morning. I had nothing to do with this entire process, and they have got it wrong.
David Bain, a retired Canadian judge whose report on David Bain's compensation bid was rejected by the government, says today's settlement is aimed at stopping Mr Bain from taking further legal action. Ian Binney says he stands by the findings of his report that Mr Bain is innocent on the balance of probabilities. He says he was insulted by the government's decision to reject his report and stick to its original position that Mr Bain cannot prove he's innocent. And you can hear the interview with Justice Binney shortly on Checkpoint with John Campbell. A developer says it's too soon to talk about compensation for 300 Canterbury people whose brand new houses may be flood prone. Silverstream Estates, north of Christchurch, was fast-tracked using special earthquake legislation. It is home to many who were forced to leave the city's residential red zones. The mistake calculating flood levels was picked up by chance by a builder's surveyor. Work is now underway by the original surveyor to work out how many are affected. A spokesperson for the developers, Fred Ram, says it's too early to say who will pay to fix the problem.
Our absolute focus is to understand what the levels are, and then once we understand what we're dealing with, we can then take the next step forward. This is way too early to be commenting on anything until we actually know what it is that we're talking about.
Fred Ram says homeowners will be told within a week who is affected. The pace of growth in house prices is at its fastest in nearly 13 years. Quotable Value's National House Index rose 14.1% in the year to July, with the average price hitting a record $602,000. Strongest growth was in Waikato and Bay of Plenty, which had around 30% annual growth, nearly double the Auckland market. QV's national spokesperson Andrea Rush says there's little sign of the market reacting to planned new lending restrictions. She says for now the market is being driven by low interest rates, strong demand and too few properties. Melanoma New Zealand is welcoming Pharmac's decision to fund the drug Keytruda for patients in advanced stages of the disease. The drug buying agency has confirmed today that the drug will be publicly funded from September the 1st. It earlier announced funding for an alternative melanoma drug, Opdivo, from July this year. The Chief Executive of Melanoma New Zealand, Linda Flay, says the announcement is a breakthrough for the 300 or so patients a year who will benefit from both drugs.
We now have 2 effective funded therapies available, which is a huge improvement on chemotherapy, which really has never been that effective. So it really is breakthrough. It will save lives, and there will be many, many satisfied patients out there.
Linda Flay says it could save patients who currently self-fund the drug up to $300,000 in a few years. Met Service says some South Island regions should prepare for heavy snowfalls tomorrow. There's a heavy snow warning for inland parts of Southland, Otago and South Canterbury for Wednesday and Thursday. Met Service meteorologist Lisa Murray says between 5 and 10 centimetres of snow is expected to fall below 200 metres, with up to 30 centimetres falling above 400 metres. Dunedin and Christchurch could get covered in a blanket of snow on Thursday night as another cold front moves across the South Island. State Highway 94 from Theano to Milford Sound is closing now due to snow. In sport, outgoing Southern Steel coach Nolene Taurua says she has no ill feelings towards Netball New Zealand. Taurua is taking up the position of head coach of the Sunshine Coast franchise, the team backed by NRL club, the Melbourne Storm, in Australia's new domestic competition, which starts next year. Last year, Taurua, New Zealand's most successful Trans-Tasman coach, was overlooked for the Silver Ferns top job. Netball New Zealand instead opted for Janine Southby. However, Taurua says her decision wasn't in spite of Netball New Zealand.
I've got my masters, I've been around New Zealand for a very long time, in the ANZ for a very long time, so I'm looking for ventures that's going to develop and grow me. Yeah, and really that's what it's all about. I think it's a two-way process basically, and both parties have to walk towards the same door.
Nolene Taurua. The New Zealand rowing squad is fit and healthy ahead of their campaign, which starts on the first day of the Rio Olympics. Men's pair team member Eric Murray says the course is fair, although it may get a bit rough if the wind gets up. And as far as the pollution is concerned, it's not been a problem so far.
There's a lot of fish, so that means that it's pretty healthy, wouldn't you say? So I think we've had protocols from the NZOC, we've had protocols from Row New Zealand around having our water bottles in plastic bags, hand sanitiser, not trying to get water too much around yourself, and so far so good. I think everybody's been vigilant on that.
New Zealand rower Eric Murray. That's the news.
Tax haven scrutiny.
I'm quite satisfied that any assessment the EU will do will pass muster.
More holes in Swiss cheese.
To say foreign ownership is not having any profound effect in Auckland is against what everybody who has been in an auction in Auckland knows.
A genuine grievance or a cheap shot?
It is outrageous, personal and vindicative, and that's where it's come from. It's called political utu.
Getting to the point. Susie Ferguson and Guy Aspinall, Morning Report, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, political rancour and social division in America. Political historian Wendy Wall argues the US has been here before, decades ago. And after 10, from sleeping rough as a child to helping the homeless in Wellington, we meet the remarkable Regina Tito. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Patchy drizzle developing tomorrow, turning to rain in the evening. Waikato to Taumarunui, also Taupo and Taihape. Cloudy tomorrow with showers turning to rain in the afternoon, possibly heavy. Gisborne to Wairarapa becoming fine this afternoon, occasional light rain tomorrow. Taranaki to Wellington, cloudy periods with the odd evening shower. Rain tomorrow, heavy about the ranges, clearing in the afternoon apart from isolated showers. Nelson, Marlborough, Christchurch and North Canterbury, occasional rain tomorrow, mostly during the morning, and snow lowering to 400 metres about Christchurch at night. For the remainder of Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, fine but a few showers about the south coast. Periods of rain tomorrow, falling as snow above 200 metres with some heavy falls. Bulla and Westland, occasional rain tomorrow, possibly heavy, and the Chatham Islands, a few showers. It's 5:09.
Thanks, Katrina. We begin tonight with the case that has gripped and polarised the country for 22 years. It began with the deaths of 5 people in Dunedin in 1994, all of them shot. David Bain was found guilty of their murder in 1995. On 3 occasions, that verdict was upheld by the Court of Appeal. But in 2007, the Privy Council determined a substantial miscarriage of justice had occurred and quashed David Bain's conviction. In 2009, the jury in a High Court retrial found David Bain not guilty. The issue of compensation followed, and that's been similarly polarised. But today the government announced it will pay him nearly $1 million in a full and final settlement. The government insists the $925,000 is not compensation, but money for the time and cost of settling the case. Unlike the Tainapura case, there will be no apology. In response, David Bain, who spent 13 years in prison, says the government's got it wrong and he is innocent. Sharon Brett Kelly reports.
More than 20 years after he was convicted of the murder of 5 of his family members, David Bain's legal battle is over. After a number of reviews and appeals failed, the Privy Council quashed the conviction in 2007 and he was acquitted in a retrial in 2009. But 7 years later, the Justice Minister Amy Adams says a report has found that Mr Bain has not met a threshold to prove his innocence.
There is accordingly no basis on which Cabinet could be satisfied that Mr Bain had met the established threshold for compensation for wrongful conviction and imprisonment. Accordingly, no statement of innocence or payment of compensation under the guidelines will be made to Mr Bain.
The case has cost taxpayers millions of dollars in legal fees, reports and reviews, and for the 13 years Mr Bain spent in prison at around $100,000 a year. Amy Adams says Mr Bain and his lawyers do not accept Mr Callinan's findings, but the $925,000 ex gratia payment will avoid further legal action.
Mr Bain has accepted this payment in full and final settlement of all matters. This resolution is, I believe, a pragmatic one that recognises the unique circumstances of this case and a desire on all sides to bring this matter to a close.
Ms Adams says it is one of the most complex, unique and high-profile cases New Zealand has ever known. The author of the report, Ian Callinan QC, says it is a case like no other and it is likely no one will ever know what happened.
Very, very few cases. In fact, I know of none that has been considered by so many different judges over such a long period. It was a difficult case.
In what way?
Well, the complexity of the facts and the elapse of a long period of time.
Outside his home in Christchurch, David Bain told RNZ News the government and Mr Callinan got it wrong.
Basically, the only thing I have to say is that Ms Adams, Ms Collins, Mr Callinan, they've all got it wrong. I am innocent. I didn't do anything that morning. I had nothing to do with this entire process, and they have got it wrong.
When did you get notification?
I'm sorry, I'm not willing to answer any questions.
Not answering any questions.
Okay. Thank you for the time.
A friend, Lindsay Robertson, says he hopes Mr Bain can get on with his life as a father and husband, but the payment is wrong.
It seems like hush money to me. But I guess in the end, if it allows Dave to settle down and have a nice life with his new family, to put some of the crap behind him and get on with his life, then that's a good thing.
Catherine Spencer has known David Bain since the early 1990s when she taught him German. She says the legal wrangle is over, but he will never have a normal life.
It's very difficult within the confines of a small country like New Zealand. He's very recognisable. And this case has polarised the whole of New Zealand. And just as people recognise Arthur Allen Thomas all these years later, that will remain to be the same for David.
More than 22 years after 5 Bain family members were found shot dead at 65 Every Street, people in South Dunedin are divided over the settlement.
They're just neglecting the issue and just trying to bob it off, and the rest of us as well.
I don't think he should have got it.
Why not?
Well, the evidence pointed towards him doing it, didn't it?
I'm not quite sure if he's not guilty or not. I've never been convinced.
I feel that way too. Well, I guess they kind of have to, don't they? It's such a grey area.
Yeah.
They're not saying he's guilty, they're not saying he's not guilty, but yet they've taken X amount of years away from his life.
Yeah.
So they've given it to everyone else, so they have to give him something. So go Bain, get another woolen jersey.
A long-time supporter, Joe Karam, says David Bain's claim for compensation has occupied him almost full-time for 6 years. He says Mr Bain has not yet been paid and he cannot comment further until the government completes the settlement. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sharon Brett Kelly tēnei.
The way the government's handled David Bain's compensation claim has come in for heavy criticism from opposition parties. The Labor Party says the only reason taxpayers now have to shell out nearly $1 million is because the government's totally botched the whole process. And the ACT Party believes that David Bain still hasn't received justice. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Labour's Justice spokesperson Jacinda Ardern says everyone has wanted to see some kind of resolution to David Bain's case, but she says that could have happened years ago if the process had been dealt with more competently from the beginning.
Regardless of anyone's personal view on the case, I think it's undeniable that the process itself has been absolutely botched. More than 6 years this has dragged out, and I think the ex gratia payment we're seeing being made by the Crown as a result has almost become an inevitability because of that.
The Greens co-leader Matiria Tudei is also critical of the way the claim has been handled.
The government process in handling this compensation claim has been appalling, and if the payment that's being made is in recognition of that, I think it's the least that they could do. Whether you agree whether David Bain is proven innocent or not, the government must treat these compensation applications with a great deal more justice and much more speedily than they have done.
But the ACT Party leader David Seymour says the Crown should have paid David Bain proper compensation. He describes today's outcome as a tragedy for justice.
Recently we've had John Banks receive an apology from the judiciary but no money. David Bain gets money but not an apology, and you'd have to wonder what the judicial system is actually trying to say to people.
Mr Bain was acquitted of all charges in a 2009 retrial. Mr Seymour says the findings of the court should not be ignored.
He was not found guilty of a crime and he was imprisoned, and therefore he's eligible for compensation regardless of how many different reports various national ministers have shopped around for in order to try and find a politically comfortable solution.
The Justice Minister Amy Adams says this has been a pragmatic decision to bring to an end an issue that's divided New Zealand for many years. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
The government's response to David Bain's compensation bid and the decision to not pay compensation was based upon a report by a retired Australian High Court judge, Ian Callanan. Justice Callanan concluded David Bain was not innocent beyond reasonable doubt and therefore that he did not meet the extraordinary circumstances test for compensation. But a previous report on the same subject by retired Canadian judge Ian Binney had been rejected by the government. Justice Binney found David Bain did deserve compensation. He says the $925,000 ex gratia payment announced today is an attempt to do as little as possible while also doing enough to persuade the Bain camp to stop its pursuit of compensation.
Nevertheless, from the government's point of view, the symbolism is they are still saying this man can't prove he's innocent. And a large part of my report is that, well, if he can't prove his innocence, it's because the evidence was messed up by the police and the Crown scientists, including burning the carpet that had these very important footprints on it, despite the police manual saying that the evidence is to be preserved. So it seems to me very unfair to look at somebody you put in jail on what the Privy Council held was a wrongful conviction and say, oh, Mr. Bain, you can't prove your case because you haven't come up with the evidence, when the evidence was in the possession of the police and they messed it up.
You concluded, I think, this is the phrase, on the balance of probabilities. That was your phrase, wasn't it?
Yes.
That David Bain was innocent, which is a much higher barrier than not guilty because reasonable doubt enters the not guilty equation. Do you stand by that description on the balance of probabilities?
Yes, absolutely I do.
Why?
Because I think in the circumstantial evidence was, to my mind, very compelling. I thought the evidence, you're probably very familiar with it, the footprint evidence was compelling from the evidence of the Crown expert, not a defense expert, the Crown expert. The fact that, according to the prosecution, he murdered members of the family other than the father, then ran around his paper route in running shoes, and the police own investigation showed there was no sign of blood in the running shoes, even though the socks were bloodied. Well, it's just inconceivable that somebody running a paper route in bloodied socks is not going to leave a trace of blood in the running shoes. It seems to me the whole theory of shooting 4 people, then knowing that the father is sleeping just outside the back door, can come in at any time and find this scene of carnage, and yet David Bain to run out on his paper route, knowing that if the father came across this scene, the first thing he'd do would be to call the police, and that would be it for David Bain. So none of the story hangs together. It's a kind of a prosecution that was built on what struck me as a very inept effort by the defense, and David Bain suffers the consequences because otherwise the police look bad. I don't think the issue in these cases is whether the police look good or bad. I think the issue is, can we learn something from what put this guy in jail for 13 years on a record which the Privy Council said was a wrongful conviction.
You, of course, came back and said all of this, and it was rejected by the then Minister Judith Collins, and there was quite a pointed public spat between her and you. Robert Fisher QC was then appointed to look at your report, and he identified what he called fundamental errors of principle. What now is your response to the government's role in all of this, given the reception your report had from the minister?
I was called to meet with Justice Minister Collins a few days after my report was submitted. So I was in Cairo. I flew from Cairo to Auckland. The interview with the minister lasted 15 minutes. She had absolutely no comment on the substance of the report. I don't think she'd read the report. I don't know why I was brought to New Zealand but it must have cost over $10,000 in plane fares for the Justice Minister just to sort of insult me to my face by saying, we don't agree. So the whole thing started with Justice Minister Collins, and the government has simply been determined to be true to that initial position, and all the way along it's bucked any suggestion that David Bain could be innocent.
Justice Ian Binney, who did the first report that recommended compensation, speaking from Canada. We'll have more on this after 6 o'clock tonight. It's 23 minutes past 5. The naming rights sponsor of the Chiefs rugby team wants a player who reportedly yelled homophobic abuse at a member of the public sent to counselling. Waikato man Brendan Barraclough was with his partner at some hot pools last night. Chief players were also there, but Mr Barraclough says when they left, one of the players shouted homophobic comments at them. As Alex Ashton reports, the team's jersey sponsor, Gallagher, isn't happy.
Brendan Barraclough says the Chiefs players, clad in costumes and having a few drinks at the bar, were friendly and polite at first. But when he and his partner went to leave, he says one of the players' attitudes suddenly changed.
We were coming back up the hill towards the pub where you park, and you could hear someone yelling, but you couldn't really hear it. And as we got closer, we could hear what the guy was saying, and he was saying, "Oh, here come the gays, here come the gays. Come on, face, here come the gays."
Brendan Barraclough says the players' behaviour was disgusting.
You get it all the time, kind of thing. Random people say different things, but you get over it and you learn to just brush it off. But does that make it okay? No. It just means that I ignore it. But there's lots of people out there who can't ignore it and get affected by it.
Gallagher Group is the Chiefs' head sponsor. Its sponsorship and community executive, Margaret Comer, says it's hugely disappointed by the comments, and the Chiefs franchise will be too. But she says she's confident it'll be dealt with appropriately, so they won't be pulling support.
Everybody at some stage in their life makes a stupid mistake. I just hope that this person, whoever it is, receives the correct and the appropriate counselling and will face up to what has occurred. It's just not on.
As well as counselling, Margaret Comer says the player involved needs a crash course.
One, how to behave as a chief in the community, and two, about saying those sorts of things that are, that's from the 1950s stuff.
Moves to combat homophobia in rugby are already underway. Rugby union officials, along with their counterparts in league, hockey, netball and football, have committed to having a set of guidelines to reduce discrimination in the sport in place by the end of the year. In May, Hurricanes players Adi Savia and Victor Vito donned rainbow laces during a game, and the head of New Zealand Rugby, Steve Chew, is on record saying the country is ready for a gay All Black. An Otago University sport management lecturer, Sally Shaw, has researched homophobia in sport and says this looks like a classic example.
That is the challenge for our sport organisations to make their sports as truly inclusive as possible, so that not just one-off scenarios like this don't happen, but the very culture of antagonism towards all kinds of diverse groups is just not acceptable.
Brendan Barraclough has a message for the player involved. Grow up.
Look at the position you're in. Look at the difference you could make just by being who you are and the team that you are and what you do. You're entitled to your opinion, but sometimes those opinions need to be kept to yourself.
The Chiefs have been approached for comment. For Checkpoint, call Alex Ashton, TNA.
Yes, as Alex said, the Chiefs have been approached for comment, and we are expecting CEO Andrew Flexman to join us just after Katrina with the headlines somewhere about 5:35. Last night on Checkpoint, Māori Party co-leader Marama Fox told us the party does not support Helen Clark's bid to become Secretary-General of the UN. Ms Fox argued the former Labour Prime Minister had betrayed Māori with, amongst other things, the foreshore and seabed legislation and the decision to not sign up to the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The politician who found herself most at the centre of the opposition to the foreshore and seabed legislation was, of course, Tariana Turia. First elected to Parliament as a Labour MP, she left the Labour Party, resigned as an MP, forced a by-election in her electorate and returned to Parliament as the Māori Party's first MP. 12 years on, Dame Tariana Turia says that while she understands Marama Fox's point of view, she supports Helen Clark's bid for the UN.
Well, while I take into account that what they did, and it was appalling, the fact is, John, that I'm pretty pragmatic, and I think that you can't actually hold these things against people without considering the political implications of the time. Now, I know that had Helen and them gone the other way on the foreshore and seabed, the rest of New Zealand would have been furious about it. So I did try to keep that in my mind when I was thinking about what she was saying and doing. But I am absolutely of the view that there is no political party in this country, apart from Peter Dunn, who can hold their hand up and say that they haven't impacted on Indigenous rights. They all have in some form or another. And so I'm trying to base my view on what I know about Helen, how well I know her, and because I know she'd do a great job, John.
That does seem somewhat extraordinary in the context of what happened in 2003, 2004, because you walked away from the Labour Party and established the Māori Party as a direct result of your sense of betrayal over the foreshore and seabed bill. So 12 years on, Marama Fox can't forgive her for that and for other things, but principally for that. And you can?
Well, while I was in politics, I tried really hard not to be personal, to see everything as political. And, I can appreciate my own family weren't happy at all at the time. But, we've all moved on. We know that there are more important things than personal issues that may have happened to me. My concern really was about the impact that had on our people generally, to lose the last piece of customary land that they held by default. So, we do our best while we're in there in Parliament. We try to make all the right decisions. But as I said before, if we opposed politicians on the grounds of history, we wouldn't be going with any of them.
Dame Tariana Turia talking to me earlier today. 5:29 coming up. Analysts say New Zealand has little to fear from a European investigation into the Panama Papers. Strong support for a government plan to legalise the sale and supply of e-cigarettes. Winter finally arrives in the south, and it's going to arrive with a real vengeance. And the teenagers heading to Rio, yes, our youngest Olympians, all of that and much more coming up. But first, historically on time, the 5:30 headlines at 5:30 with Katrina Batten.
Amazing. A retired Canadian judge whose report on David Bain's compensation bid was rejected by the government says today's settlement is aimed at stopping Mr Bain from taking further legal action. The government has denied Mr Bain compensation after a final report by a retired Australian High Court judge, Ian Callanan, found he had not met the threshold to prove his innocence. However, it will make a $925,000 ex gratia payment to Mr Bain for the time and cost of settling the case and to avoid further legal action. Canadian Ian Binney told Checkpoint he stands by the findings of his report that Mr Bain is innocent on the balance of probabilities. A Hamilton man says he's disgusted at homophobic comments directed at him by a Chiefs rugby player. Brendan Barraclough says he and his partner were at the Ōkaroiri Hot Springs last night when the Chiefs were having drinks. He says the team members were initially polite, but as they left, one of the men shouted, "Here come the gays," and other sexually explicit comments. A developer says it's too soon to talk about compensation for 300 Canterbury people whose brand new houses may be flood prone. The mistake calculating flood levels was picked up by chance by a builder's surveyor at Silverstream Estates north of Christchurch. The pace of growth in house prices is at its fastest in nearly 13 years. Quotable Value's National House Index rose 14.1% in the year to July, with the average price hitting a record $602,000. Waikato and Bay of Plenty had about 30% annual growth, nearly double the Auckland market. Melanoma New Zealand is welcoming Pharmac's decision to fund the drug Keytruda for patients in advanced stages of the disease. The drug buying agency has confirmed today the drug will be publicly funded from September. Those are the headlines. I'll be back at 6 with more news, sport and weather.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now with Nona Peltier, who's sitting beside me in the studio with a big old stash of papers. Nona, latest QV figures are amongst them, I presume?
Yes, well, we've just heard that QV, we've cracked the 600,000 mark for national house prices. Wow.
So that's average, is it? National house price average?
That's an average.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big increase over the last, that's over a year. We're at, 14.1%. So that's a big hike. And we're seeing increases everywhere, even in places that all around Auckland, but in further afield as well. And in whether or not these LVRs, this is the loan to the value ratios, which the banks are restricting. Have we seen any impact there? There is some indication that some investors have pulled their deposits because they no longer qualify, because some of the banks are already at their point where they really can't lend anything below that 40% mark anyway, because they've been lending for ages.
And the banks have been coming out quite explicitly in the past few weeks. I mean, the banks who've been lending like they're printing money for the past decade or whatever are now saying we're going to exercise greater caution. The bar is being set higher. So all this kind of language is entering the equation, but the property prices keep rising.
The property prices do keep rising, and that's because people like to own homes, and they're prepared to pay, really, seemingly any price. 600,000, and almost, well, of course, about $1 million in Auckland. So, yeah, it's a lot of money for a house. Anyways, the RBA, that's the Reserve Bank of Australia, seem a little less concerned about their housing market. They've lowered their key interest rate this afternoon to an all-time low of 1.5%.
Holy moly.
That's right. And it was not quite priced into the market, so we've seen some movement in our currency this afternoon.
We would have gone up against the Aussie, wouldn't we?
We did. A whole half a cent.
Yep.
And overnight, yesterday we were talking about how the New Zealand dollar has moved mostly because of the US dollar. Overnight it was dragged down by the Australian dollar because the market was anticipating this cut. And so the New Zealand dollar was 71.8 US cents this afternoon. 95.5 Australian and 54.4 British pence. So, yeah, the New Zealand dollar is very strong. Next week, we're expecting to hear from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand on our monetary policy statement and our key interest rate.
So, given the fact that the inflation rate in New Zealand is below the range it's meant to be in, and given that the dollar is so high, you would be expecting to see an interest rate cut.
Yes, and also the Reserve Bank of Australia has just come out with their statement, which sounds very much like what we heard a couple of weeks ago from the RNZ and what we'll probably hear next week. And for our share market, we were down 27 points, not very much. We're still at 7,329, which is a 0.4% fall.
Nona Peltier, thank you so much, Nona. Appreciate it. Earlier in the program, we brought you the story of Waikato man Brendan Barraclough, who said a Chiefs player or someone associated with the team shouted homophobic comments at him at the Okoroiri hot pools last night. The naming rights sponsor of the team, Gallagher, wants the players sent to counselling. We've just received a phone call now, I think, from Chief CEO Andrew Flexman. Are you there, Andrew?
I am indeed.
Hi, welcome to Checkpoint. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, look, it's an incident that we've been sort of dealing with internally most of today. Came to my attention very late last night. So it's clearly an incident that's happened as a result of a team celebration yesterday at the Okoroa pools. And unfortunately, a comment was made by one of the members of the Chiefs squad.
So can I just confirm this? So it was a player who said this?
Yes, correct. Yep.
And are you naming that player?
We've gone out publicly. We've just issued a statement. So, yes, we are naming the player. It's Michael Allardyce. So he's come out and made a statement expressing, and I feel in a particularly heartfelt manner, his regret at the comments that were made, and qualifying the reality of which I might add, John, simply doesn't excuse the tenor of the comment.
So what? Sorry, I haven't got his statement. What's he saying?
Well, basically, essentially, what he's saying is he made a comment that we all accept, including himself, was inappropriate and offensive, that was expressed in a public place, in a public arena. The comment itself was not, and I accept this position from Michael, was not directed at Brendan himself. In fact, Michael was even unaware of the presence of Brendan and the colleagues he was with at the pools at the time the comment was made. So the comment was directed at two of his teammates who had just entered the venue who were dressed in costume. So Michael accepts that the comments that were made were offensive, they were inappropriate. Michael's hugely regretful about having made them. But it's our position, as articulated by Michael, and we accept that position, that they were not directed at Brendan himself.
Okay, now look,
that doesn't excuse the comment.
I can't even read the comments out on national radio. So he's reported to have yelled out, "Here come the gays," and you're now saying he was talking to fellow teammates, and then he describes an action that I simply can't read out. Now, these are professional rugby players. They've just played in the semi-final of the Super Rugby competition. People look up to them, and they are role models. And is this the kind of behaviour you think is acceptable in any circumstances, regardless of who he's talking to? Don't you expect more from them?
Well, I think you know the answer to that. I certainly do. The answer to that is no. We don't think it's acceptable. Michael, on reflection, doesn't think it's acceptable either. And it doesn't matter whether it so happens that this is a high-profile sports person that's made the comment. But frankly, if it wasn't a high-profile sports person and I overheard that in a public place, I would be offended by it.
Right. Okay, so what happens? What happens now?
Well, what happens now is that Michael has made and I think done the right thing. He's spoken to Brendan personally, so he's rung him up to express his sincere regrets at the offence that was taken to the comments. We're in a conversation at the moment with, obviously, Michael as a Chiefs player, as a New Zealand Rugby Union contracted player. So we're in a discussion with New Zealand as we speak about what action, if any, is likely to be appropriate following the incident, which is now we've got to the bottom of. And Michael, too, in my opinion, is inherent credit, has fronted up on and spoken to the person that was offended by it. Understands and accepts the error of his ways. And I think I honestly say, speaking to you tonight, that he's learned a significant lesson from what's unfolded over the last 24 hours.
Andrew Flexman, Chief CEO, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Andrew Flexman, interesting that homophobia has been discussed at length at quite high levels of the NZRU, in fact by Steve Chu, and it's been very much an issue over the past few weeks. It's coming up to 20 minutes to 6. New Zealand has little to fear from a European investigation into the Panama Papers, but analysts are hard-pressed to take concerns that New Zealand could be placed on a tax haven blacklist seriously, arguing the country already well exceeds the EU standards for good behaviour. The EU may investigate New Zealand's tax laws as it tries to crack down on countries that are operating as tax havens. Our economics correspondent Patrick O'Mara has been looking at this.
Revelations that Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca helped the super-rich hide their wealth prompted the creation of a European Parliamentary Committee to examine the shortcomings in its own tax rules and crack down on tax havens. The co-rapporteur of the 65-strong committee looking into the Panama Papers, Yape Korfud, says uncooperative countries are on notice.
When we deal with third countries that acts like a tax haven, we need clear sanctions if they're not going to cooperate to implement the OECD standards.
But fears that New Zealanders in the EU's sights appear overblown. A tax partner at PwC, Jeff Nightingale, says New Zealand doesn't fall into that category.
Uncooperative jurisdictions, and those are jurisdictions that won't implement the OECD multinational base erosion measures, that lack transparency, don't exchange information, encourage harmful tax practices, those kinds of things. And I think by any measure, New Zealand's tax system meets all the EU criteria.
That's reinforced by New Zealand's double tax agreements with a number of EU members, which allows for the exchange of tax information. And with tighter foreign trust rules in the wind following the Schuon inquiry into the Panama Papers, the Revenue Minister Michael Woodhouse says he's comfortable about any potential investigation.
The sorts of questions around transparency and the tax framework that we have, which considerably passes muster with the OECD, means that I'm quite relaxed about any inquiry.
Many of the foreign trust changes will be enforced by the time the European Parliamentary Committee wraps up its investigation in June next year. Indeed, the Europeans appear more concerned about their own failings. Tax avoidance is estimated to cost European Union members up to €190 billion, or 295 billion New Zealand dollars, in lost revenue every year. Yape Korfud says he's pushing for measures that will tackle tax avoiders and those assisting them.
Some of the things we are fighting for is, for example, for the banks and law firms and accounting firms to have real sanctions if they engage in tax evasion, and if they do it repeatedly and systematically. At the end of the day, it should be possible for them to lose their license to run a business.
That could be a tall order. European nations compete vigorously among themselves to offer tax breaks and attract business, and allow big multinationals to evade taxes. Yape Korfud wants to stamp it out by strengthening cooperation in the EU. But he admits that tax challenge will be difficult to overcome. For Checkpoint, Patrick O'Mara.
There's strong support today for a government plan to legalise the sale and supply of all electronic or e-cigarettes. The Associate Health Minister says the current laws are confusing and don't work. Our health correspondent Karen Brown reports.
E-cigarettes mimic smoking, but instead of smoke they produce vapour, which people inhale in a process known as vaping. The vapour comes from the solution or liquid used, either nicotine or more often a flavouring agent. Currently, the sale and supply of e-cigarettes using nicotine is illegal, although it's okay for people to import them for their own use. But the Minister, Mr Lotu Inga, says the law is confusing and it means regulations contained in the Smoke-Free Environments Act and the Medicines Act aren't enforced.
We have pretty much a hole in the law that we need to address. It is a product that is growing in sales around the world, particularly in the United Kingdom. We've seen sales increase. And, we think it's the appropriate time to go out and consult on whether, this should be regulated further in New Zealand.
The Minister is unable to say how many retailers may be flouting the law.
We're concerned that they may become available to children, that there are, not safety aspects around the use of those e-cigarettes. they're largely going unregulated. And, we want to, see some parameters, some rules around the use and the sale of e-cigarettes.
Smoking causes up to 5,000 deaths a year in this country, and while rates have dropped, they remain higher among Māori, Pacific, young and poor people particularly. The proposed changes mean all e-cigarettes, including those using nicotine, would be legal. The sale and supply to children and those under 18 would be prohibited, along with advertising of e-cigarettes and their use in smoke-free areas. An Associate Professor of Public Health at Massey University, Mariwa Glover, applauds the move.
It's really going to be a turning point for tobacco control and for saving lives and getting us to smoke-free 2025.
Dr. Glover says vaping is safe and certainly safer than smoking regular cigarettes.
At the moment, we still don't see any negative harms occurring for people who have even been long-term vaping. Of course, it's not 30 years or 40 years, but the most important thing is we're getting immediate improvement for people, and I think that will extend their life.
An Auckland health worker, Rebecca Rufiu-Collins, who set up the Vape to Save group, says e-cigarettes are a cheaper alternative to cigarettes, but getting them is too hard.
They want to be able to purchase nicotine over the counter instead of online. There's families out there that struggle. They don't even have internet. And at the moment, that's the only way they can access nicotine e-juice is online for their personal use.
Consultation closes on September 12, with precise regulation plans going to Cabinet by year end. For Checkpoint, Karen Brown.
It's coming up to 14 minutes to 6. The Crown says a woman accused of letting her mother starve to death in her own waste left her for up to 10 days. Ina Dung was 76 years old when she died of dehydration and malnutrition last year and was found lying dead and half naked on a deeply stained mattress in the home she shared with her daughter and 2 flatmates. But Cindy Taylor, who was charged with her mother's manslaughter, has told the court she loved her mother and there was no way she killed her. Edward Gay has been at the High Court in Auckland and he filed this report.
The Crown prosecutor Natalie Walker asked Cindy Taylor how her mother could have got necrotic ulcers, gangrenous open wounds and chemical burns from her own waste had she been properly cared for and cleaned in the final days of her life. She also pointed to the pathologist's report, which found Ina Dung died of malnourishment and dehydration, and that she would have received no water in the 4 or 5 days before her death, despite it being the height of summer. Cindy Taylor responded.
She's the one who refused to take any fluids or refused to eat any food. So with you saying that I failed to provide the necessities for my mother is wrong. I never denied her anything. All I ever did was try to show her, try to be the daughter that she wanted me to be. I wanted to show her that I could do this and look after her.
Cindy Taylor said Luana and Brian Taylor, her flatmates and friends charged with failing to get Miss Dung help, had actually gone out of their way to help her family.
This is a woman who chose to refuse in the end to take anything, and I'm getting blamed for that. That is not right. I love my mum, but I would not kill her.
Miss Walker took Miss Taylor through the disturbing autopsy photographs of her mother.
Your mother, on the 16th of January when this photograph was taken, was incredibly emaciated, wasn't she?
She does look thin there.
No, not just thin, emaciated. There's a difference. Do you understand the difference?
I think I do.
Cindy Taylor later said the photographs made her mother appear thinner than she was because of her position and the poor lighting in the room. She said her mother was defecating and urinating in her bed on purpose and was playing games, but she would clean her daily.
Someone being in that state, 29 kilograms, emaciated, wasted away, no muscle tissue, would be impossible for her to have walked, stood up, supported herself. Would you accept that?
I suppose.
As well as her wasted appearance, Miss Dung had 14 fractured ribs and a fractured breastbone. Miss Walker said Miss Dung would have been in severe pain and wouldn't have been able to use the toilet on her own. But Cindy Taylor denied all knowledge of the fractures and said there were occasions when her mother purposefully fell over, including one episode when she fell down the steps. She said she helped her mother up, but there was no sign of her being in pain. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi ko Edward Gay tēnei.
Close to 200 athletes will represent New Zealand at the Rio Olympics next month. At one end of the age spectrum, one of New Zealand's oldest and most accomplished Olympians, Sir Mark Todd, competing in his 8th Games, a national record. At the other end of the age spectrum, half a dozen athletes who are still in their teens, competing in their first Olympics, hoping to achieve similar feats to that of Sir Mark. And as Matt Chatterton reports, well, there's a chance they could.
Spearheading the teen charge is one of New Zealand's brightest medal hopefuls, the #1 women's golfer in the world, Lydia Ko. Ko's been in hot form this year, winning 4 times on the LPGA Tour and producing a further 10 top 10 finishes. The 19-year-old's been a big campaigner for golf's re-inclusion at the Olympics, which is making its first appearance in 112 years. She says while a number of her top male counterparts are pulling out, being an Olympic athlete is a career highlight.
Obviously, golf is a very individual sport. I think you to be in that place where you're amongst, other athletes, not just in golf, but, in other sports. I think it's definitely going to be a different feeling.
The Olympics' other new sport, rugby sevens, will also feature a New Zealand teenager, Rieko Ioane. The 18-year-old's been a part of the New Zealand sevens team for 3 years and is regarded as one of the quickest players in world rugby. His 21-year-old brother, Akira, is also part of the team, and Rieko says they never expected to become Olympians playing rugby.
Being an Olympian, you only think you can do that if you're a track athlete mainly, but other than that I thought, no chance, but especially when the sevens was named in the Olympics, instantly I thought that's what I want to do. I'm still young, so still got a lot of years, so just kind of looking forward to the experience.
18-year-old Hayden Phillips will also be part of a New Zealand team, the men's Black Sticks. The Manawatu midfielder only made his test debut in March and is now heading to the Olympics less than a year out of high school. Also catapulting himself into the New Zealand Olympic team after a whirlwind year is the country's first ever competitor in the trampoline, Dylan Schmidt, who's 19. But it's his fellow teen gymnast Courtney McGregor who takes the title as New Zealand's youngest Olympian for 2016. She'll be 17 when competing in the artistic gymnastics event at Rio. McGregor's still 2 years older than New Zealand's youngest ever Olympian, swimmer Rebecca Perrott, who competed at the 1976 Montreal Games. McGregor's spent the last couple of months training in Boise in the United States on a university scholarship. And she says despite 3 years of groundwork, it's only just sinking in that she's made the team.
I think it's definitely starting to feel a lot more real now, especially being away from home. I don't think it really hit me until we started organising our kit and our sizing and things like that, and it's getting really real now.
The New Zealand diver Lizzie Q, like McGregor, is studying in America while training on the diving platform. Q's studying chemistry and business management and hopes to work for a cosmetic company following her diving career. In the meantime, she's focused on doing her best in the black colours in Rio, but admits she's got to the Olympics 4 years earlier than expected.
I would love to make finals in my first Olympics. The goal has always been 2020, and to be able to go to 2016 as that stepping stone and that experience before the 2020 where I feel like I will be at my peak is just amazing. If I made finals, I would be over the moon.
The final teenager representing New Zealand has had a steady rise in her sport over the past 18 months. At the end of last year, Eliza McCartney made headlines for breaking the world junior pole vault record, clearing 4.64 metres. This year, she extended her New Zealand record when she vaulted 4.8 metres, a height that's only been beaten by 8 other athletes this season. McCartney's Olympic goal is to make the 12-women final, but she says her first challenge will be getting her 4.5 metre pole into the plane's carry-on.
So that's a bit of an issue. A lot of the time we struggle, and we have had a few issues flying. Most planes can take them, so most of the time it's all good. We get them on the flight okay, but often you do turn up and your poles aren't there, and that's quite a problem because you cannot pole vault without them.
While getting her equipment to Rio may be an issue, McCartney and the rest of New Zealand's teenage athletes all agree being part of the Olympics is a dream come true. For Checkpoint, Matt Chatterton Tine.
If you thought you managed to escape winter, and I suspect some of us did, it's arrived. And according to the Met Service, it's a month late, but it's going to make up for that. Blizzard-like conditions with heavy snowfall and cold winds are expected from early morning tomorrow across Southland, Otago and Canterbury. Roads are already closing in some areas. State Highway 94 from Te Anau to Milford Sound was the first to close at 5 o'clock tonight. A short time ago, Met Service meteorologist Georgina Griffiths came into the studio to tell me, well, what we can expect.
Well, I mean, maximums of 5 or 6 by the end of the week for places like Dunedin, plus wind chill, blizzard-like conditions once the snow comes in, and we'll talk about where and when the snow is likely to fall. And even, Christchurch and into Wellington, temperatures are really going to drop from Thursday, Friday and into Saturday. So in for a very cold week, and even that cold lingers into the week following. So the first half of August, extremely cold for the South Island. Welcome to winter.
So unusually cold for August?
Yes, so we're running late this year. Of course, we've had such a mild winter to date, and I think it will come as a bit of a shock to the system, and it's a bad time of year, the lambing and the calving, and unless you're a ski field, in which case you've had lots of snow in the last week and you're going to get a lot more. So let's talk about this as a widespread low snow event for the east of the South Island. Heavier snow starts kicking in from 6 a.m. tomorrow, and we're really looking for heavy snow above 400 metres, so 15 to 30 centimetres if you're inland Southland, inland Otago, inland Canterbury, south of Fairlie. So that's where the current warning is in force.
Of course, so above 400 metres is actually quite low, isn't it? I mean, lots of inland central Otago, for example, it would all be above 400 metres.
That's right. So heavy and low snow. Now, what happens next, of course, we've got to watch for the remainder of the eastern South Island, so North Canterbury, Kaikoura Coast for Thursday, Friday, and the snow lingers. So expect further snow to even lower levels Thursday, Friday, Otago, Southland, also Canterbury and likely the Kaikoura Coast. Snow flurry expected into possibly on Saturday for the Rimataka Hill Road. And of course, all of the ski fields will get a lot more. But it's going to be cold, prolonged, southeasterly, really going to impact widespread and snow lowering even further as we move into the second half of the week. So, significant disruption to things like transport, roading, potentially power lines, depending on how fragile where you live and how fragile the network is or not. And so it's a cold event. It's a really unusual event.
So this is a genuine winter blast. So there will
That's
be
right.
road closures, there may be lines down, and there will be bitterly cold winds with it?
I think a bit of a shock to the system for even the townies or people who live right at sea level. It's going to be cold, very cold in the next 2 weeks, but particularly that back half of this week for eastern South Island and also Wellington, let's not forget Wellington. Also Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa in line for some heavy rain and or snow above 700 metres potentially as we move in the weekend. So it's going to be raining and onshore and cold and gloomy for the eastern North Island. They don't mind the rain so much, but that's the roading around the central plateau for the weekend, likely to see some snow in Tongariro National Park, of course all the ski fields around the Taihape area. So if you're travelling in the next 6 or 7 days, you're going to have to check in with all the road snow warnings that we've got in place.
And Georgina, forgive my ignorance as a townie, but you mentioned before lambing.
That's right.
August would be quite early lambing though, wouldn't it?
Depends where you are in the country. Of course, the Waikato's already started, and whilst we're not expecting snow north of Taupo, it's going to be pretty chilly, even for places like Tauranga and Hamilton and Auckland. That wind chill is going to be noticeable, so rug up the kids warm, and if you're farming, you're going to have to think about the wind chill even for the upper North Island. So cold event coming.
Georgina, we talked about this at the beginning, but this does sound like July weather rather than August weather. When was the last time we had an August that was quite this cold?
Well, actually, it is July weather, okay? We're running a month late and bang, welcome to winter. So we are going to have the temperatures we should have had about a month ago, those power balls and rugging up the kids and all the rest of it, low, widespread snow, wind chill, blizzard-like conditions for the farming community once it starts snowing in the next few days if you're at altitude and in those exposed places. So if you remember last year, we actually had a really cold and frosty July.
Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah, and that sort of prolonged into September. We had a very cold September last year, and that was an El Nino thing. This one, it's pure and simple Southern Ocean. So it's just a mean, long-lived southerly coming off the ice for us.
Georgina Griffiths, who is a fantastic meteorologist, and we always really enjoy her company when she comes into the studio. Lots and lots of feedback coming in on the Chiefs player yelling out homophobic comments at these hot pools yesterday. He's been named as Michael Allardyce. He's issued a formal apology. I have it here in front of me. Lorenzo says, seriously, that's it? The head of whichever rugby board feels that the Simian player apologising for any confusion about whom he was abusing with homophobic epithets is enough? What about a full public apology? And John, Michael is a public figure who's looked up to by young New Zealanders regardless of intent. His comments should be viewed as being tantamount to those of a racist nature. If views on homophobia are to change, those who our young people look up to need to promote equality in matters of love. And this too, John, Michael is a public figure who's looked up to by young New Zealanders. He should be removed from the squad for making such bigoted and hurtful comments. Michael Allardyce's statement says, I've chosen to come forward because I believe in being accountable and taking responsibility for your actions, and also because I can hope this can be a learning experience for others that homophobic language, even in jest, has wide-reaching and hurtful effects. That from Michael Allardyce, the player concerned. Katrina will have more on this in the news in about 30 seconds. After the news, do Cabinet guidelines for compensation need an overhaul? In other words, Cabinet wrote the guidelines for compensation for people who have served jail time and then been acquitted in 2001. Cabinet then makes a decision on the recommendation they receive. Is the process politicised? What does Tamati Kruger think about Helen Clark's UN bid and the new subdivision north of Christchurch that may be flood prone? Kia ora everyone, you are with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Thank you for being with us, however you are joining us, whether it's on the radio, old school style, or viewing us live on Freeview Channel 50 or streaming on the Radio New Zealand website. Lots in the next half hour to fit in, so let's get straight to RNZ News with Katrina Batten.
Ngā mihi nui, good evening. David Bain is angry at the government for refusing him compensation, but has accepted a special payment of nearly $1 million. Mr Bain spent 13 years in prison for the 1994 murder of his family in Dunedin before being acquitted in a retrial 7 years ago. Sharon Brett-Kelly reports.
The government announced today that David Bain will not receive any compensation for wrongful conviction or imprisonment after a report found he had not met the threshold to prove his innocence. But he will receive a special $925,000 ex gratia payment for the time and cost the case has taken to settle, and an agreement not to take any future legal action. The author of the report, retired Australian Judge Ian Callanan QC, says it is a case like no other, and it is likely no one will ever know what happened. Mr Bain agreed to the settlement but insists the government has got it wrong and he is innocent. This is Sharon Brett-Kelly.
A retired Canadian judge whose report on David Bain's compensation bid was rejected by the government says today's settlement is aimed at stopping Mr Bain from taking further legal action. Ian Binney says he stands by the findings of his report that Mr Bain is innocent on the balance of probabilities. He says he was insulted by the government's decision to reject his report and stick to its original position that Mr Bain cannot prove he's innocent. A Chiefs rugby player has apologised for making homophobic comments. Brendan Barraclough says he and his partner were at the Okaroide Springs, hot springs last night, where the Chiefs were having drinks when a player shouted, "Here come the gays," and other sexually explicit comments. Player Michael Allardyce, who made the comments, says they were not directed at Mr Barraclough but as a jest to a teammate. He says he did not mean to offend anyone. The Chiefs chief executive, Andrew Flexman, says Allardyce has apologised to Mr Barraclough and the team are considering what, if any, action will be taken. A developer says it's too soon to talk about compensation for 300 Canterbury people whose brand new houses may be flood prone. Silverstream Estates north of Christchurch was fast-tracked using special earthquake legislation and is home to many who are forced to leave the city's residential red zones. Conan Young reports.
The mistake calculating flood levels was picked up by chance by a builder's surveyor. Work is underway by the original surveyor to work out how many are affected. A spokesperson for the developers, Fred Ram, says it's too early to say who will pay to fix the problem. He says homeowners will be told within a week who is affected. A Silverstream resident, Lorna Chilton, says she's not worried about her own place becoming flooded, but does worry about property prices being affected. In Ototahi, ko Konanyang tēnei.
A 71-year-old Wellington woman with advanced melanoma is overjoyed that her and her husband will no longer have to regularly drive to Auckland for infusions now that Pharmax confirmed it will fully fund Keytruda. The drug buying agency has today announced that it will fund the drug pembrolizumab, known as Keytruda, from September the 1st. Joy Cole's husband, Jeff Cole, says the news is a huge relief for them both. He says they've had to make the trip up to Auckland every 3 weeks for the past 5 months.
It means that she doesn't have to switch from Keytruda through to Opdivo, so she doesn't have to switch drugs midstream, and being able to have the treatments at Wellington Hospital instead of having to travel to Auckland is a huge plus as well.
Jeff Cole says his wife is responding really well to Keytruda, with the most recent scan showing a number of her tumours had disappeared completely. The US Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump has described his Democratic rival Hillary Clinton as the devil in the face of continuing fire from within his own party. Speaking at a rally in Pennsylvania, Mr. Trump attacked Bernie Sanders for capitulating to Mrs. Clinton in the Democratic race.
People are angry at him, and they should be. If he would have just not done anything, just go home, go to sleep, relax, he would have been a hero. But he made a deal with the devil. She's the devil. He made a deal with the devil. It's true.
Donald Trump speaking about Hillary Clinton. In sport, money doesn't appear to have been the motivating factor for outgoing Southern Steel netball coach Nolene Taurua. Taurua has taken up the position of head coach of the Sunshine Coast franchise, the team backed by NRL club the Melbourne Storm, in Australia's new domestic competition which starts next year. She says money wasn't the reason for her decision.
You would think with this new structure over in Australia and, you know, what's been touted around, that it's very comparable between the two countries. When you think about, I suppose, a career, it's not only about the financials, but it's also about the support and, once again, that growth and development that you're going to get as an individual.
Nolene Taurua. The Warriors back rower Ben Henry has announced his retirement from rugby league following a career marred by knee injuries. The 24-year-old first made his appearance for the Warriors in 2012, but has only played 52 first-grade games following ACL injuries in 2013 and 2015 and a patella injury he sustained in the first game of this season. The ACT Brumbies assistant coach Dan McKellar has been fined $10,000 for insulting match referee Angus Gardner during his side's Super Rugby quarter-final loss to the Highlanders in Canberra 2 weekends ago. And New Zealand referee Glenn Jackson has been confirmed as the adjudicator for this weekend's Super Rugby final between the Hurricanes and the Johannesburg-based Lions in Wellington. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, the sun-soaked odyssey of Mike Brown, photographing the progress of the World Solar Challenge, a race for solar-powered cars from Darwin to Adelaide, as long as it doesn't get cloudy. We have a window on the world of graffiti, art to some, a crime to others. What does the BBC make of it? And this week's pundit, Douglas Pratt, talks religion. And there's plenty of religion to talk about on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Patchy drizzle developing tomorrow, turning to rain in the evening. Waikato to Taumaranui, also Taupo and Taihape. Cloudy tomorrow with showers turning to rain in the afternoon, possibly heavy. Gisborne to Wairarapa, becoming fine this afternoon. Occasional light rain tomorrow. Taranaki to Wellington, cloudy periods with the odd evening shower. Rain tomorrow, heavy about the ranges, clearing in the afternoon apart from isolated showers. Nelson, Marlborough, Christchurch and North Canterbury, occasional rain tomorrow, mostly during the morning, and snow lowering to 400 metres about Christchurch at night. For the remainder of Canterbury, Otago, Southland and Fiordland, fine but a few showers about the south coast. Periods of rain tomorrow, falling as snow above 200 metres with some heavy falls. Bulla and Westland occasional rain tomorrow, possibly heavy, and the Chatham Islands a few showers. It's 6:08.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina. David Bain says he's innocent and the government has it wrong. The Justice Minister, Amy Adams, has announced today the Crown will not pay compensation to Mr Bain, but will make a one-off payment of $925,000 to reflect the time and cost of making the claim. In 1995, David Bain was convicted of murdering his mother, father and 3 siblings. However, he always maintained his innocence, and following a number of unsuccessful appeals, his conviction was quashed by the Privy Council. He was then found not guilty in a High Court retrial. He spent 13 years in prison.
In March 2010, Mr Bain lodged his application for compensation with the government, who commissioned a report from retired Canadian Judge Justice Ian Binney. That report was peer-reviewed by QC Robert Fisher, who found it to have included fundamental errors of principle such that it would be unsafe to act upon it. That finding was not accepted by Mr Bain's team. In February 2015, I reached agreement with Mr Bain that these 2 reports would be put aside and that Cabinet would take a fresh look at the claim. I subsequently appointed Mr Ian Callanan QC, a highly respected retired judge of Australia's highest court, to provide advice on Mr Bain's claim.
Amy Adams says she received Ian Callanan's final report in February. She says there have been ongoing discussions with the Bain team since then.
Today, I'm releasing Mr Callanan's report, which finds that Mr Bain has not established his innocence on the balance of probabilities. The test for compensation requires that the applicant proves on the balance of probabilities that they are innocent. This is a different and higher test than the one in the courtroom on which the acquittal was based. In court, the Crown must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It is sufficient if the defence can raise reasonable doubts that they're responsible for the offence. In light of Mr Callanan's advice, and the onus being on Mr Bain, there is accordingly no basis on which Cabinet could be satisfied that Mr Bain had met the established threshold for compensation for wrongful conviction and imprisonment. Accordingly, no statement of innocence or payment of compensation under the guidelines will be made to Mr Bain.
It's Amy Adams. Outside his home in Christchurch, David Bain gave a short statement expressing his discontent.
Basically, the only thing I have to say is that Ms Adams, Ms Collins, Mr Callanan, they've all got it wrong. I am innocent. I didn't do anything that morning. I had nothing to do with this entire process, and they have got it wrong.
When did you get notification?
I'm sorry, I'm not willing to answer any questions.
Not answering any questions.
Okay. Thank you for the time.
David Bain speaking outside his house earlier. For Gary Gottlieb, a barrister who's former president of the Auckland District Law Society and of the New Zealand Criminal Bar Association, the broader issue raised by this case is that compensation is determined by Cabinet guidelines. In short, to varying degrees, the process is politicised from the outset. Gary Gottlieb has fought for compensation for people wrongly convicted and imprisoned, and for people held in jail for long periods on remand when the charges were then dropped. And what they get and whether they get it is determined by a formula decided in 2001, which then goes to the Minister, who then makes a recommendation to Cabinet.
They are open to being politicised. That's just the nature of it. And that's why I think we need to go back and rethink about the way we have Cabinet guidelines for compensation. It just seems to me that it's quite unfair. And I was mentioning to you the case about the young person who was 17 years of age, was locked up for a year and a day, never got to trial, and I wasn't a lawyer at that time, and they realised they had the wrong person just before the trial was about to start, and he was walked out of prison, and they said, oh, sorry. They came to me for compensation. They went to the Cabinet guidelines. No. The person, the justice, with great glee said, you have to have been convicted and gone to prison. You can't be on remand. You don't get a cent. Now, that is a nonsense, and I think members of the public would think that is a nonsense. We need to relook at the Cabinet guidelines, so they can't be politicised.
Is this a case where they have been politicised? Has this been an explicitly, overtly, demonstrably political process?
There's certainly a strong ring of that seems to be coming through, yep.
So how was that avoided in future?
Well, I think you probably need to set criteria out that if you are acquitted of a matter that you've been to prison, there's a retrial, the standard of having to prove your innocence seems to me to be a very high threshold to get around if you have someone who wants to say, I'm not satisfied by that. Now, in the Taina Pora thing case, the retired judge there had no doubt that he was innocent, came out very strongly on that and was quite critical of whole lots of aspects of it. But that didn't get him any more money. So I just like to know how people would feel after 21 years in jail, how you'd be happy with 2.5 million, and therefore the guidelines are just too light. It's just not right. And Taina has limited what he can buy with that money, bearing in mind what all the years, over 20 years after the event, what he can do with that money, and that's why they're arguing to get an interest factor.
It's fascinating, the response to the Bain case, isn't it? Because as Amy Adams herself said at her media conference, it is so polarised. And there are people, including the jury in Christchurch, who say that he did not do it. And there are other people who are much less persuaded of that. And there are people who, in fact, are on the record saying the jury got it wrong. Is that a balancing act that can ever be accommodated within the compensation equation?
Well, I think you have to say that if someone has been acquitted and had previously been inside, that should be the starting point for compensation.
So acquittal is the starting point. So over and above that, the idea that innocence must be proven, a much higher bar than simply being not guilty. Do you think that is the flaw here?
Yes, so that enables it to be politicised, and that's a very high standard. They're going back and rejudging it again on the paper trial, and the Queen's Counsel, or whoever it is, spends months and months reading it all and thoroughly looks at it. Now, I can tell you, I've done lots of cases, and you read the paperwork, and when it finally gets to trial, it's a different animal. And just reading words is quite different to actually having a hearing. But the reality is that's why you have to rely on it if there's an acquittal. Hey, the person's been wrongfully convicted in the past, therefore pay them some money.
Gary Gottlieb speaking to us earlier. While much of the country is backing former Prime Minister Helen Clark's tilt at the UN's top job, parts of Indigenous New Zealand believe she has unfinished business in her own backyard. Foreshore and seabed legislation passed by Ms Clark's Labour government angered many Māori and resulted in Tariana Turia quitting the party to found, of course, the Māori Party 12 years ago. This week its co-leader, Marama Fox, has spoken out against Helen Clark's nomination. Earlier on Checkpoint, Dame Tariana herself spoke in support of Helen Clark. Now Tūhoe leader Tamati Kruger is backing Ms Fox, Marama Fox. He was one of the men at the centre of the controversial Te Urewera terror raids which happened in 2007 under Helen Clark's watch, and which years later prompted an apology to the Tūhoe people. Our Māori Issues correspondent Mihinarangi Forbes reports.
It was a Monday morning when 300 armed police raided the settlement of Ruatoki, looking for terrorist activity. Just 600 locals live there. That day there was a policeman for every second resident. Many of them were children. A Ruatoki elder, Waiarani Harawira, was witness to it as it unfolded. Members of her whānau were arrested, including her brother and nephew. Speaking on their behalf, Ms Harawira recalls a conversation with her brother, who has since passed away, about what disturbed him the most.
My muku saw the laser beams on me and their father. My muku saw their father being dragged out of our home, thrown into a police car. It was bad enough that happened to him and his son. But what he would never forgive was the fact that his mokopuna had seen that happen in his home.
Tūhoe leader Tamati Kruger says the iwi has embraced a reconciliation process. They've met with Police Commissioner Mike Bush and former Police Minister Annette King, but Helen Clark has never taken up any of the offers.
For
Tūhoe. I agree with others that Helen Clark would be a greater person if she did acknowledge those issues around the foreshore and seabed, and also around Operation 8 in regards to Tūhoe. I think it'll be wonderful if she does acknowledge that and express a personal viewpoint around reconciliation of those things.
Local MP Te Ururo Flavel says the Māori Party can't back Ms Clark for the role at the UN until she acknowledges her role in the Tūhoe raids and other events such as the Seabed and Foreshore Act, the legislation which split the Labour Party and led to the establishment of the Māori Party.
The people still do the haka about it, still sing about those sorts of things, and will continue to. It's a significant issue for the Tūhoe people, and therefore, we kind of like to think that she takes it seriously as well, being the head of the government at the time.
The Māori Party has raised concerns about Ms Clark's performance on Indigenous issues while she was Prime Minister. That audio from the 2004 hikoi against the government's seabed and foreshore law change, which was pushed through Parliament by a Helen Clark-led government. John Mitchell was the chairman of Ngāti Tama, one of the tribes that won the right to test a treaty right over aqua marine farming in the Marlborough Sounds.
Well, I'd have to say that quite a number of us were pretty bitter about what Labour did. I mean, we won in the highest court in the land, short of Parliament, the Court of Appeal, the right to have these issues adjudicated, and effectively the Foreshore and Seabed Act denied us what had been a very high court decision.
Mr Mitchell, who is now retired, says the 8 iwi who formed a group to challenge the Marlborough Council over resource consents were caught up in high-level politics.
We sat in meetings with Michael Cullen and so forth. On more than one occasion, he declared that there's no way that they could accede to what we were seeking. He said that would cost us too many votes. So there was some fairly raw politics went into their decision.
Mr Mitchell says he's a proud Kiwi and would be chuffed if Helen Clark represented New Zealand, but believes she would be wise to learn from her past dealings. Waiarani Harawira, on the other hand, says there's much more work to be done before her whānau is at peace.
So, Helen Clark, the only thing I have about Helen Clark is all this happened under her regime, and at no time has she even made an attempt to apologise to Tūhoe.
Tamati Kruger says no one benefits from continuing to harbour hatred and ill feeling, and as human beings people need to move on. The offer for reconciliation is still on the table. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko mihi ngā rangi Forbes tēnei.
21 minutes past 6, up to 300 homeowners in a new subdivision north of Christchurch have just found out their area may be flood prone. Kaiapoi's Silverstream Estates was fast-tracked using special earthquake legislation and is home to many who were forced to leave Christchurch and also a local residential red zone. Conan Young reports.
The mistake calculating flood levels was picked up by chance by a builder's surveyor. Work is now underway by the original surveyor to work out how many are affected. The properties were supposed to have an extra 300 millimetres of breathing space, known as freeboard, to guard against rising sea levels, but the miscalculation means they may have been left with half this amount. I asked a spokesperson for the developers, Fred Ram, whether homeowners who had already been forced out of their homes by one natural disaster were being re-traumatised by the botched calculations.
One house is one house too many, and we're doing everything we can working with the appropriate professionals to get to the bottom of what it actually means and who is actually affected and who isn't.
But Mr Ram says it's too early to say who will pay to fix the problem.
Our absolute focus is to understand what the levels are. And then once we understand what we're dealing with, we can then take the next step forward. This is way too early to be commenting on anything until we actually know what it is that we're talking about.
A Silverstream resident, Lorna Chilton, says she's not worried about her own place becoming flooded, but does worry about property prices being affected.
That's one thing. My friend has built the house next door and it's just going on the market now, so as he said, well, that won't be good for that.
Another homeowner, Chris Veer, says he's also not worried about any immediate threat from flooding, but would like to see the problem fixed.
You're looking at 350 homes and, in excess of, I suppose, $100 million worth of property, then, yeah, they should have got it right first time round.
And so who would you like to see sort of take responsibility for that?
The engineers. The engineers, I mean, they were employed by the council to get the levels right, and if they've made a mess, then they need to make amends.
The Waimakariri District Council granted a resource consent to the developer based on the faulty data. Its chief executive, Jim Palmer, says it's only by chance the mistake was picked up by the surveyor, and it's fortunate that further homes were not built there using the incorrect flood levels.
It is industry practice to take benchmarks that are recorded on survey plans as an accurate basis for further work, and so it's unusual to then go back and recheck those benchmark levels. So it may not have been detected had that surveyor not done that work.
Jim Palmer says the earthquakes may have contributed to the benchmark markers used to establish flood levels being in the wrong position.
There is still some work to be done about how did the error occur, and there is a question mark around whether settlement following the earthquakes meant that some of the benchmarks that they were referencing to had settled, but that is yet to be confirmed.
Nobody from the firm that miscalculated the flood levels, Davis Ogilvy, has returned calls for an interview. Residents should know within a week whether their homes are affected. In Ōtautahi, ko Conan Young tēnei.
Kia ora, Conan. New Zealand has lost its most accomplished trans-Tasman netball coach. Nolene Taurua has announced she's leaving the Southern Steel to take up the position of head coach at the new Sunshine Coast franchise in Australia's domestic competition. Remember, they divorced us, which starts next year. But as Matt Chatterton reports, it wasn't a choice she made lightly.
Nolene Taurua's decision to leave New Zealand's shores for the new Australian domestic competition is a big blow for local administrators here. Taurua is New Zealand's only coach to win the Trans-Tasman competition with the Waikato Bay of Plenty Magic in 2012. Last year, she was overlooked for the Silver Ferns top job when Waimarama Timonu announced her retirement. Netball New Zealand instead appointed Janine Southby as Timonu's successor. The Sunshine Coast franchise Taurua is joining is the team being backed by National Rugby League club the Melbourne Storm. And Taurua says that was an opportunity she couldn't pass up.
With the Melbourne Storm as the backers and knowing that they're one of the best, if not the best, sporting organisation in regards to NRL, to learn from them and to be in their system is, as a netball coach, just takes me automatically up another level. And I just think, opportunities come around that's going to do that, and at a time where you have to actually decide, and the timing is right for me to step up, basically.
Taurua says while she was disappointed she didn't get the Silver Ferns job, that wasn't a factor in her decision to leave. Meanwhile, Netball New Zealand high-performance manager Steve Lancaster says he's sad to see Taurua depart.
We never like to see good people leaving our system, but at the same time, good people always have opportunities. And, I think it's just the evolution of our sport as a professional sport, particularly now that we have two competitions, one in Australia and one in New Zealand, that people are going to have options. And, some people will explore those options, but equally there are options and opportunities here in New Zealand.
Lancaster says despite Taurua's decision, he doesn't expect more New Zealand coaches to follow in her footsteps. He says the door will always be open for Taurua to return when her contract with the Sunshine Coast franchise expires in 2 years. For Checkpoint, ko Matt Chatterton tēnei.
Lots of feedback coming in on David Bain, and as always is the case on this subject, it is sharply and starkly divided. Alison says David Bain has never faced cross-examination in any court. He has not been found innocent, rather not guilty due to insufficient evidence to the contrary. But then Henry says, forget relooking at cabinet guidelines, revisit the whole policy on compensation. If the Crown fails to convict you on retrial or an appeal court acquits you, you have been wrongly imprisoned and should automatically be compensated for that loss of liberty. The criminal justice system has a high burden of proof on the Crown, beyond reasonable doubt, but if the Crown didn't meet it, you shouldn't have been imprisoned, so you should be compensated. Henry's following up, I guess, what Gary Gottlieb was talking about. So that's the general issue of compensation and how it's determined. But Rochelle says, John, the police government position is that it's the only case of its kind in the world where a sane gentleman at university, happy and loving his family, however chaotic, who was never before or after the killings, decided to kill his mother, 2 sisters and his brother, then go out at his normal time and run his normal paper round, then come back and kill his father and put on the computer, "You are the only one who deserves to live." Then call the police in such a state of shock that officers thought he was acting. How could anyone believe in and work at this horror story is beyond my understandings. I feel so sorry for David to have this hanging over his head forever. And that is exactly the kind of split you get from people who see the same case and the same evidence and the same man in such very different ways every time you cover the Bain story. We're going to end tonight. Thank you, by the way, for all your feedback. We appreciate it. We really enjoy hearing from you. Finally tonight, Richard Branson is one step closer to liftoff after Virgin Galactic secured an operating licence for space tourism. And as Gavino Garay, our friend from Reuters, reports, the billionaire entrepreneur's company could be taking the first tourists into space from as early as next year.
It's a dream that much closer to reality for Virgin Galactic. Richard Branson's commercial space company has been granted an operating license by U.S. aviation officials to fly passengers to the point of weightlessness. Once final safety tests are completed, space enthusiasts will get just that as they're rocketed some 62 miles above Earth. The license, which is a first of its kind, covers all operations of Virgin Galactic's 6-passenger 2-pilot Spaceship 2 vehicle, including commercial passenger service. That's if certain terms and conditions are first met and you're willing to pay. Tickets to the tune of $250,000 will get you a seat with some 700 others who have already put in deposits for a joyride, which includes an element of risk. In October 2014, Virgin Galactic's original Spaceship 2 vehicle broke apart during a test flight that killed the co-pilot and seriously injured the pilot. That accident was ultimately attributed to pilot error. But don't buckle up just yet. Commercial service is not expected to debut before 2017.
That story from Reuters ending our program for tonight. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening, for sending in your feedback. We appreciate it. We really enjoy your company. And we hope to have your company again from tomorrow night at 5. Until then, ka kite anō and a very good evening indeed.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. David Bain is angry at the government for refusing him compensation, but has accepted a special payment of nearly $1 million. Chiefs rugby player Michael Allardyce has apologised for making homophobic comments, saying they were just in jest to a teammate. The price of an average house in New Zealand is now more than $600,000, with prices growing at their fastest rate in nearly 13 years. Pharmac has confirmed it will fund the drug Keytruda for patients with advanced melanoma. A developer says it's too soon to talk about compensation for 300 Canterbury people whose brand new houses may be flood prone. And Donald Trump has described Hillary Clinton as the devil. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Michael Kiwanuka expands his sound while keeping it soulful on his second album. I'm Nick Bollinger and I'll be reviewing Michael Kiwanuka's Love and